All right, hello, hello. I see people are filing into this virtual room.
Hello.
So we will get started in just a couple minutes. We're going to make sure that we give everybody time who's going to be here to get here.
Welcome.
And as you all are filing into the room, you may notice, or if you're not familiar with Zoom, we may point out that there is a chat function enabled. So you can say hello, you can say where you're coming in from, you can say what SU experience you've had before, but feel free to announce yourself and say hello. I'm pretty sure everyone here is friendly.
Yes, I see some familiar names, and I know for a fact they're friendly.
That's good. I feel much more comfortable now that we've established that. Okay, I see people are chiming in, chatting in. Yes, Leopoldo from EP50. Welcome
nice.
back.
Winter, great.
Yeah. Simone, hello.
Hello, Simone.
A lot of alumni. This is good. Exciting. David Stallings, my man. It's been a few months. All right.
This is so fun.
Yeah. It's a mini reunion.
Hello from Switzerland. Hello, Switzerland. Barcelona. Oh, this is great.
Yeah, I imagine as this is getting going that some of you actually probably even know each other, which is kind of
probably
cool.
Yeah. We've got a few from same cohorts, probably. This is great.
Yeah, so I think we'll give it one more minute for people to roll in. But in the meantime, we should probably announce where we are calling in from today.
So this is the Experience Center in our new headquarters in Santa Clara. I'm guessing a few of you have been here, but many of you have not. We're really excited to be in this new building. We kind of outgrew our last space. And the space we're in right now inside the building is really a place where you can get hands-on experience with some of our technology. It's in addition to the classroom lab that most of you are familiar with from our last building. So this is a separate interactive place, more self-guided, where you can learn information about our global grand challenges, see some interesting visuals about SU and the community and where we are, and then just engage in some fun tech. Oh, and this, do you want to talk about what's behind it?
Yeah, speaking of interesting visuals, some of you may recognize this if you're part of the hardcore SU fan base. What we have behind us right now is a set of panels from one of the first sci-fi DI comic book graphic novel things that came out of SU's kind of future envisioning and design intelligence projects. And this one was set to imagine, it's meant to imagine life in the year 2030. So I don't know if you all can see this, but this is a little bit of what we have in store in the next 11 years, and we thought might be both a kind of colorful and fun backdrop for kicking off another conversation about, the future that we are rapidly hurtling into.
Yes. So welcome to our space. We're happy to have you here virtually. Should we get started?
Yeah, and welcome to our webinar. This is super exciting. Quite a few of you, I think, have a sense of what we're here to do. We're going to talk more about that in a moment, but first I want to make sure everyone knows who we are.
Good idea.
So I have the great pleasure of introducing to some of you and reintroducing to many of you my colleague and dear friend Catherine Brown, who is our Vice President of Executive Education Open Enrollment Programs at Singularity University, which means probably many of you who are alums, if you're an EP or an EIP alum, you went through a program that now is rolling up to Catherine, and she is helping to steer into this next decade of SU. And before we got Catherine, before we were lucky enough to pull her away, she was at Google for, I think, a little over 10 years.
Yeah, just under 12, actually.
Yeah. Developing executive leaders and running their internal leadership development functions. So she came to us from one of Silicon Valley's most disruptive, innovative, and dominant firms, and I think has a really interesting perspective on molding effective leaders for our new operating context.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think most of you know Jeffrey Rogers, this amazing human sitting next to me. But some of you may not know the depth of his background in experiential learning, not just here at SU, where he has been doing this since, what, 2016?
Yes.
So he has facilitated and moderated so many different experiences at SU, over 20 executive programs, EIPs. He's led several international summits. So he is well known throughout the SU universe. And his background in experiential design and learning has made it an absolute pleasure to be partnering with him on this new program we're going to be talking about this morning. But super thrilled to have him as my partner in crime, both today and in general at SU. And so we're excited to share with you kind of what we're up to next.
Yeah, and as we get into that, I should actually maybe say a little bit more about kind of what unites us both in our work with the organization and work with all of you, and our work on this webinar today. And as Catherine mentioned, we have kind of a shared background in leadership development and a shared deep interest in developing immersive, experiential learning programs at SU now. And one of the things that we've been thinking about, particularly since Catherine came on board, which was January?
Yeah, February. Yeah, June, February.
Okay, all right. So we've had about 10 months of going through these programs together and conversing with alumni. And one of the things that we've really started to notice over time is that we have routine conversations with newly minted exec ed alums, and they tend to surface from their week at SU with two very common questions. The first is, what's next, right? What is the next step in my SU learning journey? And the second is, what does all of this, all that I've learned about context and convergence and the exponential future, what does this mean for me as a leader and as a human?
Yeah, I often hear about it, and it's also worth mentioning that in my 10 months here, I'm sure you all have had experiences like this where you come across people and you feel like it's just a kindred spirit. You're like, this person speaks my language, and we share sort of some common passions around leadership development. So it's been so fun working on this. And I think one of the things, to build on what you said, Jeffrey, that I've noticed is it usually happens toward the back half of an executive program when I'm talking to EP participants. And sometimes it comes around as, okay, so you've painted this picture of an exponential future. That's pretty amazing. Sometimes overwhelming, a little bit frightening in some cases. But how am I going to navigate that? And what am I going to need to do? Because I'm getting the sense that the way I've been approaching things and leading up till now may not be as effective in this exponential future. And that's really what created the impetus for us to begin thinking about what this next step in the journey of someone like this could look like from a leadership perspective.
Yeah, we have a shared sense that a lot of you and a lot of us are coming out of these programs feeling like we probably have some assumptions and beliefs and practices that are no longer adaptive. They've done very well to get us to where we are, but they may not be future fit going forward. And that we probably need to find some new ways of understanding the context, understanding the decision-making environment, and understanding our role as effective leaders. And that's really, I think, what we're trying to address as we think about this new program offering and a new opportunity is a way that we might work to empower the kinds of leaders that the future really needs. And I would argue the future definitely needs some future fit leadership. So before we get too far into that and what that looks like, I actually want to get a better sense of you all in the room and kind of where you are in thinking about your SU experience and everything that has come after it. So I want to throw a couple of quick questions to you all. I already have a sense that a lot of you are alumni from
Yes.
programs, and most of you have even thrown in what program you attended, which is super cool, especially to see some old friends. But what I'd like to ask you now is, don't overthink it, but just throw into the chat maybe one of the most important changes that you have seen in the world at large or in your kind of operating environment as a leader since you left your SU program. Have you seen something? Have you borne witness to this accelerating change, something that has really been disruptive in your world and that also may have kind of validated some of your learning and some of the things that you took away from the program? What have you seen?
You can just type it into the chat window as you guys did when you first arrived.
And I know some of you have only been out for a couple of weeks. If you're a September 2019 EP alum like Daniel, but things are moving so quickly, I imagine you probably still have seen some changes, and maybe you walked out of that program kind of looking at a new set of indicators and picking up on a new set of signals. All right, I see Azra already. The influence of climate change, especially in the mining space in South Africa. Yeah, absolutely. Although dealing better with complex scenarios and understanding which layers am I dealing with each moment. Sounds like you spent some time with Catherine and Paul Sappho on your program, my friend. The last 2 years, the world is a different world. We're
Post-Trump
post-Trump. Well,
not quite, friends.
Maybe,
We're not quite post.
maybe. Yeah, pace layers. Established leaders not yet appreciating the challenges and opportunities. Amen to that, Ian.
Oh, interesting. Thank you, Todd, for sharing about your sermons have become a lot more positive, and some kind of frightening the tech. I think that's something we see quite often in EPs when we talk about things like human-like robotics. It can be kind of a scary topic. So thank you for being candid about what you're experiencing there.
Yeah,
some
Eric
love it, some are afraid.
mentioned acceleration of HMI. I don't know if you all saw Facebook's acquisition of Control Labs a few weeks ago for what is rumored to be about $1 billion valuation, which makes that a new unicorn in applied neurotech. That's an exciting moment. Adaptability or the lack thereof.
That's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, you're in the right place.
Yeah. Management. So a lot going on.
Simone just left 2 weeks ago, but already preparing a transformation within the organization to prepare new company positioning. Well, great. That actually sets up the next question I wanted to ask. So I feel like we're all very good when we leave an SU program. If we weren't before, we're all very good at going out into the world and seeing change,
yes,
seeing these new indicators, picking up on weak signals that we think are going to have very, very strong implications. But what I'd like to ask now is not what you've noticed externally in the world, but what have you done and how have you changed internally? How have you changed your organization, or how have you changed yourself as a leader? And I want you to be honest here, because one of the things that I suspect is that it's a lot easier for us to know that change is taking place and that change needs to happen than it is necessarily to believe that we need to change and to actually instantiate that. So I will ask you all, what have you actually started to do differently? Yeah, I do actually. There. I think that's a more appropriate, conducive slide for this conversation now. All right, Azra. Good. Richard.
Oh, the zoom out,
zoom in. From the Church of John Hagel.
John Hagel.
Good. The follow-up conversation there, Richard, would be to ask how the rest of your board or partners are cottoning to that strategy now.
Bringing purpose into your programs and your organization and your project.
Excellent. Daniel, differentiating between complicated and complex problems. Simone is ditching the legacy way of thinking, being more exponential. Sounds good.
It sounds very good.
Doesn't sound easy, but it sounds important.
Adaptive organization, building the right capabilities, exactly.
All right.
We'll be talking a bit about how we begin to build those capabilities in leaders, in all of you and others, to sort of begin transforming organizations.
Yeah, transforming organization and transforming oneself. And as I mentioned a minute ago, I've been thinking quite a bit lately about what I see as a real a gap, a real kind of chasm that exists. And it's increasingly in evidence, I think, in the culture, in popular conversations around what we're starting to have a really hard time denying about the world versus understanding what it is that we need to do about it and how to do. And I feel like there's a gap that exists that really needs to be bridged here between knowing and doing. And one of the things that we're most interested in as we think about where we can go as a community and as an organization is helping our community members and helping leaders bridge this gap, to move from knowing to doing, to move from rationally knowing I need to change to actually believing it strongly enough and seeing the opportunity to effect change. And for all of you who are coming from kind of the alumni context, I think this will be particularly resonant. You can also see this as moving from exponential thinking to exponential leadership.
Yeah, and I think this is something that has grown in urgency. The concept of a knowing doing gap has been around for a long time. You probably have heard of it in different business contexts. I think what we're noticing now is an increase in the urgency because of the increase in the complexity in the landscape in the world that we're living in. The pace of change has increased so significantly that there's more need now than ever to transition from this just thinking about it to actually doing through acts of leadership. And that's what we're going to be addressing partially in this program.
Yeah, and this is hard, and I think that we should not discount the difficulty and complexity of this task, whether it's for the individual in thinking about their carbon footprint and their consumption choices, or the organization thinking about their business model, or, I mean, I can think even of faculty in the SU ecosystem, like our AI robotics expert, Hod Lipson, who he'll put up a graphic with Moore's Law, and he'll say, you know, I know rationally that in 5 years' time, the things that my PhD students are working on, their AI research, by the time they actually get that dissertation finished, the field is going to have left that question behind, quite possibly.
Crazy to think about.
Yeah, and it's a hard thing to process what these drivers of accelerating change really mean. And I think sometimes about a quote from the management theorist Gary Hamel that I think was from something he wrote 15 years ago, where he famously asked how we can build organizations that are capable of changing at the pace of change itself. And when we know that the pace of change is accelerating, then that becomes, how do we build organizations? How do we architect solutions? How do we become leaders who are capable of changing at the pace of change itself, when that change is driven by what we can see with Moore's Law, Wright's Law, Kurzweil's Law of accelerating returns.
Right? And also in the world.
Yeah, and that brings us to your idea of this urgency that we're seeing. And you know, one of you mentioned climate change in kind of the indicators that you were watching of this exponential future taking shape and emerging. And there are a lot of amazing things that have happened in the year or years since your programs, but we can also see some of these exponential and potentially existential challenges growing in their urgency and in their complexity, facing both human communities and the host planet. I feel like this summer, at least at the end of it, there was a lot of talk about what the fires in the Amazon mean. And the fact is that that's only part of a much larger set of ecological, interrelated, super complex challenges. And this grimly depressing slide is not the Amazon, that's the Arctic. And we had wildfires across the Arctic this year, which I think are a testament to the challenges that we're facing and the real need to start to develop these exponential solutions that are going to be capable of tackling these kinds of challenges. And the fact that these challenges themselves are adaptive and complex rather than technical, I think, is part of what really makes us see a need for a new kind of leadership.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that what we're noticing is the nature of the challenges that we're facing now are fundamentally different than the ones in the last, 20, 30, 50 years. And the increase in complexity. I love this quote that we're going to have on the next slide here around, we've got 21st century technology and speed colliding head on with 20th and 19th century institutions, rules, cultures, organizations. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we sort of meet the 21st century in terms of our speed and the complexity of it with sort of our leadership and how we address those things?
Yeah, I also love this quote. This is from Emery Lovins, who's the chairman and chief scientist of the Rocky Mountain Institute, also a physicist and an energy policy advisor, and notably a really engaged creative problem solver. And I think he's spot on here. And I think we could also add 20th century leadership to this list, which is very much both a product of and a shaper of those institutions, rules, and cultures. That is, I believe, part of the problem. And that also means that a new leadership is going to be hopefully part of the solution. And
yeah, I think you're spot on. And I think some of the questions that we've been thinking about as we think about that landscape go, okay, so what is a leader or somebody who is aspiring to be that catalyst of change for the positive in the world? What do they do? So how do we do things like translate future thinking into present practice? How do we thrive in this context of ever accelerating change? How do we align our actions with our purpose so that we can shape a future in a really intentional way? How do we build a skill set of adaptability? And how do we manage this complexity, which is not a bad thing, right? It's a required thing for disruption and change and to get us where we want to go. But how do we manage that while still enabling creative problem solving at speed with innovation so that we can lead teams and organizations? And so really, as we mentioned before, this is about how do we become the kind of leader that we know the future needs.
So it will not surprise you that all of those questions are ones that I find deeply resonant. I imagine quite a few of you do as well. And these are things that SU has kind of been marinating in, these big questions about future fit leadership for quite a while. And we're starting to emerge with some new thinking around how we can develop ourselves and members of our community as future fit leaders for the 21st century who are capable of tackling these adaptive challenges and actually rising to sort of the potential that we can see in the tool set that we have available.
I also think it's worth mentioning that it's been really neat for me, at least in the short time that I've been here, to learn from all of you and to learn from the participants that I've engaged with and the folks in the SU sort of ecosystem and community, because that very much has informed kind of our thinking, our approach, in some cases been kind of validating about the direction we're heading, but we're excited to share this framework.
Yeah, and I think that is important. This is something that has been kind of iterative and has taken shape over the course of many conversations, not just internal, and many programs where we're kind of also learning our way toward what we think is going to be an appropriate model as we start to sort of conceptualize our approach to leadership as an organization and think about the capabilities that tomorrow's leaders will need. And we have a framework that's been taking shape that we're excited to share with you all I think it's safe to say, with the caveat that this is something that is still intentionally
it's evolving.
It is a liquid evolving thing, and we call this we call this the WAVE framework. And I want to point out that is not just a sexy graphic, friends, although it is indeed that. This is very intentionally a double loop learning model, and that's a concept that emerged from the learning science literature of the 1970s, which by definition and design is a continuous process. So the whole idea here is that the doing and the experimentation, both of which you all by now know we are very big on at SU, the doing and the experimentation are followed necessarily by feedback and evaluation, and then critically by significant reflection. And that then informs kind of the next round of doing an experimentation. And the reason I like a double loop learning model so much for thinking about leadership and thinking about the challenges that we face in this exponential future is that this is a model that's very appropriate for a context of accelerating change. You've probably heard me talk about this a little bit. If you've been on a program with me, this will definitely sound familiar. I believe very much that if we are living in a world that is always in the process of becoming something new, and thus we will always be new to the world, that we have the opportunity and even the imperative to become something new as well. And this, to me, is what finally gives teeth to the idea of embracing a lifelong learning journey, embracing continuous learning, is that you always have the opportunity and you'll always have the need to reflect on where you are, where you still need to go, and then try to level up to, again, become the leader that the future needs you to be.
I think it's also worth mentioning for those of you who I have worked with around these concepts of complexity. I talk a lot, and we've talked a lot about being able to see the system, and you can only do that when you sort of get outside of it and have that reflection moment. So it's just to note that we've been really intentional with how we have designed this and been thinking about it to ensure that we're kind of taking our own advice and being thoughtful about the whole fact that the framework is an iterative process is informed in part by the fact that we are living in the complexity that all of us are, and taking those moments for reflection and continuing to iterate as we go is definitely part of the fundamental underlying philosophy, both of this model and also of the design of the experience that we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm also excited to share this. This is the first time we've talked about this thing externally.
True.
And I'm excited to share this with this particular group because you all are alums. So you'll actually, as you start to see the breakdown of this WAVE framework, you'll recognize a little bit of the journey that you're already on, a journey that you've walked some significant steps toward. So let's dive into it. And kind of the first phase, and again, remember, this is a continuous thing, so it doesn't necessarily start here, but this will all sound familiar to you all, is the phase that we call wonder. And wonder is very much about adapting a future focus and contextual awareness, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is where you get exposed to what the future could look like. I have talked to so many EP participants who toward the end of the week will say, you know, I came in thinking I wanted to learn about this specific technology to implement it in my organization or my environment or community. And I did, but really what has happened is I came in looking at the future from a perspective that had it at about this big, and now it's huge. And that's a lot of what we're talking about in this phase. So this is envisioning the possible future. What could it look like? What are the things that are possible? Scanning the horizon, so taking a bigger picture view of what's actually going on. This is where you're beginning to embrace new technology and uncovering some of those tensions that we talked about. For those of you who I got to work with, we talk about polarities and managing those. That's very alive and well in sort of this wonder phase.
Yeah, and I think to tie this back to things that you all have already told me, if you're practicing a zoom out, zoom in, that's very much the kind of thing that we see as a critical capability for 21st century leaders in that wonder phase. And you know, thinking about if you were on a program with us where you did a future envisioning, a mapping, a futures wheel, where you start thinking through and forecasting possible implications of convergence and disruption from unlikely places, all of that is part of this wonder set of capabilities. And moving on from there, the next one that we have, the A and the WAVE model, is adapt. And this is where we really see leaders becoming responsive to changing conditions and contexts. If they've built some awareness through wonder and building those skills and capabilities, the next things to build are resilience and future fitness, right? And so the critical capabilities we see here are identifying and challenging biases and assumptions. We've talked a little bit about the importance of understanding that things that may have been useful for you to get to this point in your career or in the life of your organization, they may not serve you well going forward. So identifying the things that maybe you want to leave behind, which gets to this idea of unlearning appropriate to context.
And we'll talk a little bit when we talk more about some of the nuts and bolts of this experience that we're designing. We talk about self-work, and this is where a lot of that work lives. So it's only through sort of pretty deep reflection that you can identify some of your biases and your beliefs, to identify the things that may be deeply held that aren't serving you anymore, and begin the process of unlearning. It's much easier said than done, but it actually takes quite a bit of work. And so this adapt phase is really about taking a look inside and saying, okay, what are those things that aren't serving me anymore? How can I expand my thinking to see new and different perspectives, at the same time getting clear on what mine is and what's required.
Yeah, and I would say the ultimate goal here is to really take stock of and understand your mindset, current mindset, and then look to develop more of the growth mindset and that experimentalist approach that is going to serve you well through continuous learning, right? To serve you on that journey. And that journey then takes us into value. Yeah, which is where we see leaders cultivating relational ecosystems for shared value and according to a shared purpose that we would like to see and we think needs to be aligned with a goal of creating exponential impact.
And this is where taking that systems point of view that we talk about a lot is so critical. And this idea of developing agility so you can actually adapt to the evolving landscape around you, that's where this kind of comes in. Thinking about how can we focus on the future from a positive impact perspective? How can we think about things, take in all these different perspectives and land on what we think is going to benefit the whole the most?
Yeah, and when we talk about the complexity of the operating environment right now, I think one of the most important pieces of that is to understand this idea of rich interconnection, right? It's basically a cliche to say everything is connected, but actually everything is increasingly connected and in ways that can continually surprise. And so thinking intentionally about the sorts of connections you want to build and foster and the way that you can work toward setting up beneficial synergistic effects in that system is part of what we see in this value phase. And then the last part of the model, the E in WAVE, is evolve appropriately, where we want to see 21st century leaders proactively participating in and guiding the evolution of exponential technologies and their application for society, business, and for people.
I think this last one here around driving change while changing is really important too. So this is where we think about that idea of not just driving disruption, but actually being a disruptor yourself and using your sort of self as instrument, as a leader. What is it you can do to be the agent, the catalyst that drives that disruption? And acknowledging that these things are happening at the same time. So at the same time as you're creating disruption around you and in your environment, your organization, it's also happening inside. So you're hearing us talk a lot about sort of personal transformation and leadership transformation. We're going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of the program, but know that that lens is quite intentional and a bit different than other programs that we've offered to date.
Yeah, so for me, kind of I'm also fascinated by that last capability. I think that's really, really rich and deep, and there's a lot to it. And the way that I've been thinking about that is that this model of leader needs to build a capacity for innovation, right? To drive disruption, to be a future shaper, but at the same time also build a capacity for resilience, to be able to weather disruption in a future that they cannot wholly shape, right? And will you permit me to say one kind of geeky thing here too?
I think it's the right one. Go for it.
Okay, so another thing that kept coming to my mind when I was thinking about this part of the model and the WAVE framework in general is there's part of a famous Bruce Lee quote. Where, he's talking about water and that water can flow, but it can also crash. And the end of the quote is "Be like water, friend." But kind of that same power and really unique capability to move with and over without losing purpose or direction, but also able to exercise quite a bit of power in shaping that landscape as well. So, all right, so that was that.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, so this model really started to take shape, I think, when we were thinking about leaders driving digital transformation and transforming their organizations. A lot of it was, I think, initially rooted in thinking about the leader within business context. But at SU, we also know that any lasting organizational transformation and culture change critically depends on, and maybe even begins with, effectively transforming the individual as well. And we also know that many of tomorrow's leaders, and probably quite a few of you even, may not yet be working with or leading the organization that is ultimately going to be the role where you will fully realize your potential as a change agent and a future shaper of an industry, of a community, of a society. And so when we're thinking about the new program that we're creating, we want it to be not just for leaders looking to transform their organizations, but also for individuals who may be looking to transform their own leadership and to better realize the impact that they want to create in the world. And so I would say at like a fundamental level, the program we're imagining is aimed at developing those transformative individuals, the future leaders who are going to inspire and develop future leaders themselves, because that really, at the end of the day, that is the exponential thing in terms of human influence and impact amplification and enabling learning throughout your organization or community.
Perfect. So with that tee up, that's what we are on about with this experience. Let's talk a little bit about what it is.
Nuts and bolts.
The nuts and bolts. Let's do it.
Here we go.
Okay, so we've talked about the WAVE framework. The Reimagining Leadership Program, which is what we're naming it, is primarily designed to engage all of you, our participants, in that process, that WAVE process. And it's worth noting that we kind of alluded to it at the beginning, but many of you, by virtue of your experience at the executive program or an EIP, already experienced part of that wonder phase, right? You have seen a possible future, many possible futures, been exposed to that, hopefully expanded your thinking about it. So you will see that in the design of this program, we've woven in some of the other elements of that WAVE framework into it. So let's talk about when we set out to design this, what were some of our guideposts along the way? So here are some of our design goals. So we are intentional about wanting this to be a lab where you are really reimagining, redesigning yourself as a future leader. So this is a play space of sorts. This is much more workshop focused. This is going to be a sandbox where you play and try on new practices, ideas in a safe environment. And it's a community where you're going to take root and grow and work with each other ongoing. So you'll notice that the way we're talking about this and sort of structure and design is quite different than an executive program and other programs, frankly, that we've offered to date, and that this will be much more experiential. It'll be much more hands-on workshop. And we also incorporated, well, as we thought about it, we were doing so through a few different lenses. Do you want to talk about the lenses?
Well, can I say one other thing really quickly about, so all of these high-level design goals are really important to me for thinking about what exactly it is that we're trying to enable at the end of the day. And one of the theories of leadership that I ascribe to and that I think is valuable for crafting this experience and achieving our end goal is actually looking at leadership as a process and one that only exists in and as a function of interaction, right? So this program is designed to be very much conversation oriented and ultimately will be very much a product of the unique interactions and individuals in the room. So in a sense there of kind of the eating of one's own dog food, this is designed to be a complex, adaptive process and environment where we do really want to dig in and learn by doing and experiment and reflect. And those will be some of the focuses of the program design.
And it's worth noting that because that is such an important driving principle of ours, you'll notice that the cohorts for this program are much smaller. So we're not going to have a cohort of 100 people. Our goal is to design an experience where we create the forum for those kinds of like more open, vulnerable, and real and candid conversations to happen. And really, as Jeff said, to begin there, but to continue afterwards. So that's another thing we'll be talking about in terms of ongoing after the in-person experience. There's a lot more infrastructure that we're designing into this experience such that this doesn't become just one touch point, it becomes the beginning of a journey and a longer conversation.
And if you all are wondering, when we say it's not going to be 100 people, it's also not going to be 70 people. We're imagining a target cohort size of
35 or 40.
Yeah, 35 to 40 people. So it will be a much more intimate thing where you really will establish connections with everyone in the room, which I'm excited about. And Catherine mentioned lenses. We have some particular lenses that we're going to be using in this program. I should say, and this is kind of already out there, but we're specifically designing this thing for EP and EIP alumni. And we're going to build the program to leverage the foundation and context that's already been established. You all already have a good sense of what the exponential future might look like in the big picture, right? You have this sense of convergent exponential technologies and social and innovation trends. And now we want to basically dig into that world. And we want to deeply explore the questions of leadership and change and personal development in that exponential future through this particular set of lenses. So adaptive and complexity leadership theories, systems thinking, cognitive and behavioral science. We can go ahead and throw neuroscience is going to be in there as well. And then this idea of self-work as well. And that's tying back again to this idea that if you want to achieve outer impact, you're going to have to put some time into working towards something like inner mastery.
Absolutely.
So that's a little bit about how we're thinking about it from a design orientation. And now in terms of what we're actually building, a little more detail there.
Yeah, so as Jeff just said, this is really tailored design for our alumni of our EP and EIP with the hope that that becomes a sort of foundational platform on which we can build that we've collectively had exposure to. So we felt like it's going to start the conversation at a different point that's going to enable us to get into it much quicker. So,
it also means you've already done the pre-work, which
yeah,
I know none of you want to do pre-work, so that's kind of exciting. You've already done like a week of it. Yeah.
In terms of timing, we're still in development of this. Obviously, this is very nascent. Like Jeff said, this is the first time we've talked about it publicly, which is super exciting. So we're thinking our first date will likely be around the beginning of Q2 of 2020. Right now, it's looking to shape up to be about 3 days in person, on site, residential. And as I mentioned before, a big part of this is ensuring that there's a substantial amount of post-program engagement. So like I said, it's a beginning of a journey when you're together for those 3 days, but then it continues on thereafter.
And as Catherine said, the program, the core on-site portion is going to be 3 days, and it's going to be consisting of 3 kind of interwoven units. These aren't going to be blocked day by day, but they'll be sort of themes.
I think woven throughout.
Yeah, that we're going to be returning to throughout the program, again, in this kind of iterative, recursive fashion. And the units are bucketed basically like this right now in the design, where we'll be looking at systems, we'll be looking at self, and then we'll be looking at connecting self to system with the idea of exploring intervention, impact, and ultimately legacy. So some of this I think is going to sound a little bit familiar, but we're going to be going into concepts that have been teased in your other programs. At the conceptual level, now we're going to be going much further into the tactical and, how do you actually do? How do you actually achieve and sustain? And this is going to be very much based around exploring practices, right? So we will introduce quite a few things and we'll play with them a little bit during the program with the expectation then and kind of the mandate that you will then take these home. You will take these back into your work world, into your community, and you will continue to practice these and maybe share them with your organizations as you deepen that engagement and try to actually be a driver of change and an enabler of other leaders, which makes you, in a sense, there a practitioner of exponential leadership, which is our goal.
I also should mention something we didn't have on here, but just occurred to me worth mentioning is that we are in the process of identifying the partners in the SU ecosystem that we think would be the right fit to bring into this picture, into this experience, different ideas and frameworks and concepts in the areas we just mentioned. So it won't be the Catherine and Jeff show the whole time.
No.
I wanted to make sure
Thankfully
nobody thought
not.
that. Yeah,
No.
we wouldn't do that too. No, it's going to be a combination
We'll
of different folks in our ecosystem. We will be there, but it's going to be a combination of folks in our ecosystem, many of whom have deep expertise in some of these areas that we're talking about. So I wanted to just make sure that was there.
Yeah, and I think equally exciting, we're also working on engaging folks outside of the network. And so we're expanding the S universe in a sense for this bespoke program. So we're bringing in people particularly that can serve as subject matter experts and help us with the design and the delivery of some exciting new content. And with that, I actually want to tease just a little bit some of the kinds of content that we're going to get into, just as a quick, a little sample. And we talked a little bit, actually, Catherine, I think, nicely formulated this idea that many of the challenges that organizational leaders faced and successfully, I guess, rose to in the 20th century were of perhaps a qualitatively different nature than the challenges that we see increasingly informing our landscape going forward. And I think that this is actually really nicely captured and teed up in a quote here from a leadership and complexity researcher named Mary Ubin. And she, I think, has gotten to the heart of the matter here, where she says, here's the problem. When complexity comes in, which now is the condition of our world, the natural tendency, the reaction from leaders is to respond with an ordered response, right? To try to exert control. And that is absolutely not going to be adaptive, and that's not going to be effective going forward. That just doesn't play anymore. And instead, she's advocating that we need to think about crafting a complexity response. And she says that that is one that engages interaction, it engages the tensions, and it plays off of heterogeneity. And the reason that we're teeing this up here is, while we've talked a little bit on a number of programs, and probably quite a few of you are familiar with this idea of complexity as a thing that can perhaps be navigated and that you can kind of live a peaceful coexistence with and not be totally overwhelmed and swamped by in your world, we want to get into another idea in leadership, which is actually kind of leveraging complexity and using complexity to drive adaptability and innovation and more creative problem solving.
Yeah, I think the important potential mindset or lens shift here is it's not that complexity is this sort of necessary evil we have to deal with. It's actually the driver of much of the innovation and disruption that we want for our future. So it's not about how do I deal with this thing that's really difficult. It's more how do I not just exist in this environment, but enable and even foster these complex challenges, navigate them, and craft responses that are not trying to create order from chaos immediately. And some of you have heard us talk about this in slightly different language around adaptive challenges, implying a technical solution to that same kind of thing. It's that black and white thinking that I talk about with mindsets versus the explorer mindset of asking questions and thinking about what experiments you can run. That's really the heart of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think for me this is interesting because it's a little bit counterintuitive, right? That complexity is not a thing that we're going to shun, but instead, just as it is a driver of innovation in the economy, it can be a driver of innovation in the organization and a driver of adaptability and adaptation as a response to pressure for the individual problem solver. And where I think this connects to some of the SU experience that you all have already had is when we look at the content, we look at some of the concepts that are out in the S universe, you can actually see already a little bit of the drive to enable complexity as something that is going to foster the emergence of innovation, adaptability, culture change, a lot of the things that we want. And there's a concept, and I know if you've been in the S universe long enough, you love a good law or heuristic that is useful for future thinkers. A relatively recent one is this idea that's known as the law of requisite complexity that was first articulated by a guy named Russ Marion in a white paper from, I think, 2011. And the basic thesis is this. The idea is that you need to counter complexity with complexity, that if you want to rise to a complex challenge or navigate a complex environment effectively, you need to have a complex response, right? That you're not going to be able to exert the old order. And to put this in the context of the S universe and probably a lot of your alumni experiences, you know, if you've read Salim Ismail's Exponential Organizations, and he's talking about how to make an organization that can move faster, that can learn faster, that can be more adaptable, a lot of what he's encouraging you to do at a strategic level in that framework, if you remember the ideas and scale were the acronyms, if you look at something like his mandate to increase autonomy or increase decentralization, what he's trying to do there is to push leaders to create complex adaptive systems in the structure of their organization to give rise to learning, to give rise to innovation. In effect, to have an emergent property of these exponential adaptive behaviors. And so you can see it there, you can see it in, I would argue, like the architecture of X Prize as like a system for creating innovations and breakthroughs through the interaction of the constituent pieces in that ecosystem. If you were lucky enough to ever do a creative collaboration session with Dan Klein, part of what he's trying to get you all to do when he mashes you up in these silly improv games is to come up with things that none of you would necessarily be able to come up with on your own or through a prescribed process. That in fact, the result is richer and the result is more innovative and the result might be more like a breakthrough or at least a phase shift because of the linkages that are formed in that kind of complex environment. And so this is the kind of idea that we'll explore in much more depth and detail.
Yeah, just a taste of one of the things we're going to be exploring as part of this experience. We wanted to give you sort of a real example and a real taste of the kind of thing we're talking about instead of staying high level.
Yeah, and you know, something to even take back into the rest of your day and thinking about how you do or don't enable and leverage complexity in your organization and in your approach to problem solving and your own life.
So that's a little slice of some of the content we'll be covering and the ways we might do it. I wanted to touch a little bit on intentionality from a design perspective on the environment. So by design, we've talked about this experience being one that is going to require more reflection. And to do that, we needed to create an environment where people could connect more readily. So we are being intentional about creating a space for you to really engage with each other. Think about how you're showing up as a leader today, how you did in the past, what you want to be doing in the future. That means you're going to be exploring your own behaviors, your own mindsets, your own tendencies, things that might be preventing you from becoming that leader that the future needs of you. So that's going to require things like unlearning and relearning and examining biases and where you're in those sort of cognitive ruts. And in order to do that, we made a decision about where we host the program. So the program is going to be in Silicon Valley, but it will not be here on the SU campus in our building. And that's because we want to gather you somewhere special, and specifically somewhere that is conducive to the kind of experience we're designing, where it can really have you can really have open and honest conversations. So things like, instead of talking about a fireside chat, how about we actually have a fire to gather around to have those conversations? We're both really excited about this. Another thing we connect on is an absolute love of the outdoors. So, so more to come on that with specifics on exactly where we're thinking and what, but I just wanted you to know that if you haven't gotten the hint already, this experience is going to feel quite different than a lot of the other SU experiences that maybe you're used to. So one of the elements of that is where we're choosing to actually host it.
Yeah, and I would say if you are the person, and I know some of you probably are because you come and talk to me during the executive program, if you're the person who's always wondering why our programs, why the EP doesn't feature a hike in the redwoods, this is probably the program for you. We have quite a bit that we're cooking up to make this one really not just different, but deeply immersive and experiential, and again, kind of conducive to asking a certain type of question and engaging in a certain way. And in a sense, getting back to this idea of creating a sandbox or a laboratory, we actually want to provide an environment that will enable you to kind of try on some of these new ideas, behaviors, practices of future fit leadership and see how they work for you, and then take them back to your world. You may find that you like some of them quite a bit better. But not to worry. I know you're wondering, will there be exponential tech? And the answer, of course, is yes, friends.
For sure.
And it's kind of cool that we're actually in the Experience Center, and we were talking about the lab team earlier. We're developing some new experiential modules, again, specifically for this program with the Uncommon Partners lab team. It's led by Kyle Nell, who many of you know, who is very much a fan and pioneer of applied neuro and behavior scientists and the neuro wearables and whatnot. And we're going to be using some of these hands-on tech experiences, which will be easier again to do with a smaller cohort, to really explore some of the key themes on the program from a little bit of a different technologically enabled angle.
So that's a little snapshot. We are super excited, in case it didn't show, about this. And as I said before, there's a big component of this that has lasting impact far beyond the 3-day in-person experience. So a lot of focus that Jeffrey and I are sort of aimed at right now is thinking really deeply about what the post-program experience really looks like. So if we view that first 3 days as really a launch pad kind of sorts, the real work, as any sort of leadership development experience is, starts when you leave. And it starts when you go back to your home context and your environment and are given the chance to actually apply what it is you've learned, sort of back on your day job in whatever capacity that looks like. So as a result, we're going to be building and spending some time thinking pretty critically about what a post-program accountability and engagement plan can look like. And that also is fed into our decision to make the cohorts quite small, to increase the likelihood that you all will be able to stay connected with each other, probably in small group format within your cohort, and continue to grow and learn as a community and support each other's learning. Share how your experiments are going, what you're learning, get ideas from your colleagues and your fellow participants, and really curate like a follow-on content for all of you to continue to grow and deepen your learning. What else would you add about that?
Yeah, well, for me, this gets back to the idea that the program is going to be very much practice-based.
Yep.
And so it's important for us as our thought leaders on the program are going to be exposing you all and us to this new set of practices and tools and techniques and strategies that we're going to be bundling those into a facilitator's toolkit to kind of guide your post-program learning and conversation and deepening of your engagement with those practices. So we want to give you things that you can take back to the organization. And we're going to be going through some activities in the scope of the program, some exercises that I can say, with a few of them in mind, you don't realize the full potential the first time you do them. The first time you do the thing, you learn a couple things about yourself, you learn a little bit about this framework or tool, but they really reward sustained engagement over time. And we want to support that for you, but then again, embracing this idea of exponential leadership, we want to support you taking that back to your organization or your community or the leaders that you want to enable and foster in your life. And I'll also say that I somewhat secretly have a dream that the cohorts coming out of this leadership program, the kind of second step in the SU executive journey, might also then become a cadre of perhaps leader mentors who we can feed back into engaging with our larger executive program and EIP alumni community, where we have so many people coming out saying, I'd love to talk to someone who's been through all of this and is maybe further along in their experience and can help me make sense of what this means for me as a human and a leader. So for us, this very much is intended to develop a synergy within the community.
Yeah. Who knows, we might have our first cohort here on this call today.
Could be.
Could be.
Could be. I would love to see some of these people again.
So that's a little bit about what we are on about as we're creating this Reimagining leadership experience and program. I'm looking at time, realizing we should probably wrap. I wanted to say thank you for hanging in there and for being with us and spending some of your time with us. We are excited to talk more about this. So the headline, yes, is stay tuned.
Yeah, again, this is a thing in development, but a lot of the pieces are already in place. This is a little bit of a kind of first look for our community insiders, but it's on its way. We would love to have your engagement in this.
Absolutely.
And
reach out to us anytime. You know where we live.
Yeah, those are our email addresses. So shoot us emails. We also will be sharing a follow-up email with all of you. We'll have this video available soon, if not yet, a recording of this session. And I think we can also throw in a couple of links to find more information about the program as it's developing. And I would love also to maybe throw in a few supplemental pieces kind of suggesting some of the content and shape that we're taking here.
For sure.
But thank you all so much for joining. It's really fun to talk about this first with people who are already in our alum community. And
wonderful to see so many familiar names too from all around the world. So thank you for making time.
Yeah. Be in touch, friends. Hope to hear from and see all of you soon, or at the very least in the not too distant exponential future.
Sounds good. Bye.